after the Civil War and the 14th and 15th Amendments, so giving blacks citizenships and black males the right to vote, Oregon did not voted against those laws, even though they were federal. And so when we think about that, also comes segregation and the limits of bodies of color and where they can live, where they could go to school. So the creation of black schools or colored schools at the time didn't happen until 1867. And in 1873, schools were integrated, but they usually black folks didn't go beyond the 6th grade. And so in the 1920s, the first forced location of blacks began as they are pushed out of white neighborhoods to certain sections of Northeast Portland. And the black community is relocated to around where the Memorial Coliseum area is. And I also want to mention, in certain areas of downtown, there were a thriving black community. So the Golden West Hotel was where, and there were several black churches around in that area. So this is where black folks congregated. This is where they built community. This is where, after they went to church, there were a lot of different events that happened. There was also, during that time in the 1900s, there was a black stable community, a middle class, a professional community. And there was also a rise in the Klan around the same time, an increase in the Klan. And so from one report, it was around 35,000 Klan members in the 1920s. And also around this time, when blacks were being shuffled around and pushed out of neighborhoods, we had a concentrated effort, an intense effort by the Realty Board of Portland that forbade folks from selling property to black folks. And so, and in their literature until I think the 1950s, they stated that having black folks in your communities would lower your property values and increase crime rates. And in some places, and insurance actually for home insurance actually forbade folks from selling houses to Chinese, to Filipinos, to blacks, to Native Americans. They explicitly stated that. And so there were ways that they kept home ownership out of the hands of black folks and other folks of color, because wealth is primarily through home ownership, right? And so during the during the time of the World War II, there was a black community, and it was around in Albina area, around where the Memorial Coliseum is now. And but all of the able-bodied white males were fighting overseas in World War II, and so and there still was a relatively small black community, a small population, and I must also state that the military was predominantly segregated, and majority of blacks were not allowed to fight overseas. And so most of the folks that were in the military were here in the United States in munitions, loading up munitions into ships, which was a very dangerous job. But so Vanport, or Kaiser, wanted to create a shipyard here in Portland and needed a lot of labor. And one of the things that he proposed was having folks from out east, and predominantly black folks, come here and do the labor, but the community was opposed to it. No one wanted the black laborers to work in the shipyards here or live in their neighborhoods. And so he created Vanport, which was this swampy area, and it was supposed to be temporary housing, so they were very shabbily built. And so after the war, when all the white male soldiers came back, there was a loss of jobs, people were leaving, but there was still a strong neighborhood in Vanport. And it wasn't just black folks. There were also other folks there, white folks, and folks from throughout Asia and Mexico and South America as well, right? So there were communities, other communities that were there, but it was one of the places where black folks were allowed to stay. And in 1948, the flood, there were reports the flood had been, or the dikes around the area that were keeping the waters away from Vanport, out of Vanport, were faulty, and people recognized that. And there are some reports, some folks from the community really feel that this was intentional because there had been a lot of pushback from those folks still being in Vanport and still being in Portland. And some folks actually feel that the dikes breaking were actually intentional. And so with the flood, the black community was forced to live in, were crowded into the Albina area. And as more black folks moved into that area, more white folks started moving out of the areas. And still at this time, black folks are still not allowed to own property. And so there's also redlining. So banks will not lend to folks to refinance their homes, to take care of their homes if they own homes there. They weren't allowed to buy property. And so a lot of times the homes that were in that area were owned by absentee landlords as well. And they weren't allowed even at times to refinance and build those homes again. So a lot of those places became dilapidated. And you have infrastructure with the fleeing of folks and with suburbanization. Also, and I know I'm missing some things and you're gonna fill me in, please do. Also the freeway was built, and we had also Memorial Coliseum that was built, which further crowded the black community and destroyed black businesses, churches, homes, and the community, really disrupted the community. And so, and with the Lloyd Center as well. And so you have, as whites are moving out, the diversion of funds and resources are also going with them. So you have an infrastructure that is just, that is abandoned, ignored. And also policing, so there's also a relationship between policing and what was happening in the city or in that area. And so there was an instance of over-policing, and Karen Gibson goes into this a lot in Black and Blue in Albina, and Policing in Albina, which is a really great article, and talks about how the over-policing, criminalization of black folks, of keeping them in their place, as well as the under-policing, so not protecting the neighborhoods, really also led to the vulnerability of that community, because folks from within the community and outside of the community understood that those areas were places where crime could take place, and there were very little consequences for it, right? And so when urban renewal starts to happen in the 50s, places start determining where urban renewal will start taking place. And they start looking at, in particular in Portland, the Albina area as an area that is blighted. It's high in crime, it's high in unemployment, the infrastructure is pretty much, is bare thin, is bare spread thin? Something like that. and so they choose this area to be as urban renewal areas. And I also want to mention that black folks really resisted. There was, and other folks in the community resisted urban renewal projects. And so there were a lot of protests, there were a lot of public hearings, And this was ignored by public officials in their eagerness to get these fundings, and also because of racism, right? And so one of the urban renewal projects that's most famous is Emmanuel Hospital. And alongside the freeway expansion that cuts through the Black community as well. But so Emmanuel Hospital was an area, was the hospital in Albina area, for those of you who don't know. And they were receiving federal dollars to expand their campus. And basically they, some by eminent domain, some they sold or bought out the landowners and forced them out in other ways. But basically destroyed 8 city blocks, I do believe, of the neighborhood in Albina area to build this campus, which was never built, and because of funding that fell through. And when I moved here in 2000, I would take the bus through, and I would look around and just see grass growing and trash and just vacant lots. It looked like a wasteland. And so a lot of those areas sat undeveloped at the time. And this was also an intentional thing, because in devaluing the land, it makes it also ripe for other urban renewal and development projects. And so, yes, please.
So I just wanted to do a little addendum about the word blight and how it was so unevenly applied in terms of housing in Portland. So when the folks wanted to build Emmanuel Hospital, it was run by the Portland Development Commission, part of that effort. They went into Albina and did a house-by-house survey to determine, I mean, you know, like when you hear the word blight, like do you imagine like meth labs and rats and falling down everything, tiles falling off of the roof, like all this, that's what you imagine, right? Well, the PDC defined blight as having a clawfoot bathtub. If you had a clawfoot bathtub in your house, then it was considered blighted. If you had an unfinished basement, then it was considered blighted. Sorry, Brian.
That's okay.
If you had a drop, so this is a drop ceiling. So if you could tear this away and there would be another structural ceiling above this. So if you had a drop ceiling, clawfoot bathtub, unfinished basement, or if you had a house where, you know those houses where the garage is at street level and you get out of your garage and then you walk up and your house is above the garage, that was another condition of blight. So if they were going to actually enforce those conditions upon every house in Portland, Oregon, I mean, unfinished basements, like, then, you know, it would be considered, like, basically all of Portland would be considered to be under a condition of blight. But they didn't. They applied that condition of blight only when they wanted the land from African American families. So.
And while you're at it,
Oh, yes.
because I defined, I mentioned redlining. Could you kind of talk about that too?
Yeah, so unless you're Bill Gates, right, or someone like that with that kind of money, a Google millionaire, you have to get financing for a home. You have to go to a bank and say, this is, you know, I qualify, I have a job, and these are my finances, and blah, 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 blah. And the bank says, okay, we'll give you financing. Sure. But for African American families and other families of color, the only area where they would provide that financing would be in the Albina neighborhood. There's actually a sign up in the Albina neighborhood today that showed where the literal red line was drawn by banks. So if you were African American family and you wanted to buy in Selwood, you wanted to buy in Mount Tabor, you wanted to buy in any other part of Portland, you would not get financing to do so. So,
Thank you. No, thank you. And so a lot of those policies and practices and the Portland Development Commission, the PDC, what she mentioned earlier, a lot of these urban renewal and revitalization programs really intentionally happen in collaboration with the PDC, and we're led by the PDC. And so these continued, so redlining, a lot of the things that we experienced in the 2006 when the housing bubble started to burst were tactics, basically, that had happened to Black folks since practices by banks since the 50s and beyond, right, and before. And so a lot of the tactics of these high interest rates, of these, and there were also practices where folks would buy houses and think that they owned the houses outright, but actually they were still owned by other banks and they would be taken back at any time. And so this is a practice, folks were still having this happen to them in 2000. They were losing their houses, thinking that they owned the houses outright and finding out that they were owned by another bank. And so these were tactics that not only just happened in Portland, but it happened to Black folks and other folks of color and poor folks throughout this country. But it does have a very racialized component, right? I do want to talk about that because, you know, all of these practices that we talk about intentionality behind them and the impacts behind them are classist and racist. And we need to keep that in mind, that these are certain populations, marginalized populations, that are targeted intentionally. And so these practices kept happening, and as Portland started to gentrify in the 90s and 2000s, we see more displacement. And so it was a similar pattern of how redevelopment and infrastructure and the greening, and you talk about green development. And so when we talk about gentrification, all of these are, the greening of Portland in particular had an effect of, you know, wanting to make the downtown, revitalize certain neighborhoods for livability, in particular low carbon models of neighborhoods, and those were intentionally to attract a certain professional class of people, of a white, young class, you know, who are moving up in mobility in their class, you know, who have either money now or will make money and spend money in the future. And so how this happens now is similar to what Ruth Glass describes in the 60s, right? Of having an intentional desired class of people that developers and policymakers are really designing the city for, and ignoring the folks that are there and who are in benefits of gaining more tax revenues, because we also look at, with the advancement of neoliberalism and the tax bases, a lot of governments rely on taxes, right, to get revenue, to do projects. So bringing in a higher tax base also is beneficial. So these policies work together to really lure certain folks in and displace others.
So I teach a class at Portland State University, and it is really focused on the construction of whiteness in Oregon and the history of communities of color. It's a 10-week course, and I have 10 minutes. So, not all. Oh my gosh, I was going to get over here. So I'm going to try to sort of limit it at this point to
I think we're going to be like 15
from World War II to the present. And for each community of color in Oregon, there were and continue to be these ground swells of events, dramatic, violent, significant, that affect what we live, how we live today. So in my class, I really interrogate thoroughly, looking at this history, looking at facts, just facts. The idea that Portland is this progressive, great place, and everyone's got their act together because we all voted for Obama, and we recycle, and we bike, and so aren't we the greatest, sort of thing. And we aren't like the South. We aren't the way that every, this virulent image of racists kind of reality. One of the things I do point out is there was an amazing report done by the Coalition of Communities of Color in 2010 that unfortunately subsequent reports show that the statistics are very much still true. That the statistics that were presented in terms of disparities, employment, housing, poverty rates, graduation rates, all of that, health status, almost exactly mirror that which communities of color, the African American communities, faced in Mississippi in the 1960s. So the idea that we are this we got our act together kind of community when we really still are walking around with those kinds of disparities is a dramatic falsehood. I'm going to talk about a few issues, again, from World War II on. So one of the most significant and violent displacements that occurred in Oregon, of course, was Japanese internment. So after 1942, or after Pearl Harbor, studies have been shown, documents have been unearthed that show that the primary group of people lobbying the federal government, lobbying the Roosevelt administration to bring about internment, where it came from Oregon. And this wasn't an isolated incident. There had been pieces of legislation in Oregon in the 1920s and 30s that limited home ownership, that limited access to education. So I think there's this idea that all of a sudden Pearl Harbor and internment came out of nowhere, and we were just terrified, and we had to put, protect our communities kind of thing. No, it provided a great excuse just to continue what had been happening for decades already. So from Oregon and Washington, 48,000 people living east or living west of the Cascades were put into internment camps, all of California. The majority of Oregonians, anyone of 1/16th Japanese heritage, 1/16th, so that's like what? Your great? I can't remember the tree. Like your great grandmother, or maybe even harder. So if you had 1/16th Japanese blood, then you were put into a concentration camp. The majority of Oregonians went to a camp in Idaho called Minidoka. So that was a dramatic, epic displacement. What had been here before in Portland, in the North Park blocks, was a neighborhood called Nihonmachi. So think of like around where Old Town Pizza is, considered Chinatown now. So imagine yourself walking down those blocks, several decades ago. What you would have encountered would have been hundreds and hundreds of Japanese-owned businesses, hotels, grocery stores, newspapers, cleaners, doctors, dentists, lawyers, an entire vibrant, healthy neighborhood that overnight in May of 1942 was emptied out. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, along with Japanese, other Asian Americans who, the officials didn't take the time to tell who was Japanese and who wasn't. They were swept along as well. So just imagine what would be. I mean, you're not supposed to do that as a historian. I break the historian rules. Like to imagine what would have been if Nihonmachi was not emptied out, was not just flushed. And it's really very tragic and sad to think about it. So that was one significant, massive displacement. Of the 48,000 people from Oregon and Washington who were pushed out, only 10,000 people came back. So it's another one of those, imagine who would have been here kind of stories of what could have been for Portland. When they did come back, they faced significant, dramatic, long-lasting discrimination. They were thought to be the enemy, simply because of the land, that perhaps generations ago came from. It's worth saying, of course, my grandfather's name is Herzog. You don't get much more German than that. They lived on Long Island, as close to Germany practically as we were to Japan. Nothing happened to him, of course. So this idea of race loyalty, it's important to recognize the way in which it happens still, In terms of race loyalty, we see it very, very, very much so right now with Arab American community. You must automatically be. It was the same idea. You must automatically be the enemy if you were of Japanese descent. So that was one very significant displacement. Another displacement that did take place in Portland but affected Portland significantly was in the 1950s, well, I'm going to back up a tiny bit, 1930s, the Roosevelt administration enacted something called the Indian New Deal. And one of the most significant aspects of that was that it awarded federal recognition to tribes, meaning that the federal government said, all right, you are a tribe, you get to have jurisdiction over your own land, you get to have certain, to the extent to which we can give back any land that we took from you, we will do that. We won't take any more. It was a significant step forward. It created the idea of preference in hiring for Native Americans in anything related to Native American issues, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It created loan programs, all of that. And then in the post-war era, everything was about assimilation, right? Everything was about, we all get along, we all just bleed into the fabric of white capitalist America. And so Douglas McKay, who is the Secretary of the Interior, former Oregon governor, it's really important to indict Oregon in a lot of these things, enacted a policy called termination. And what termination did is it terminated that federal recognition. It said, the best thing for you is if you just blend. Everybody blend. You just come to, cities and you become like the white people, and we're going to just wipe away all the rights that you had had under termination, under federal recognition. It's important to talk about what that did to the landscape of Oregon. So, under termination, 867,000 acres of prime timberland, most significantly around the Rogue Valley, Klamath River area, were just taken outright from Native Americans and sold to timber interests. It was the era where we were building suburbs, right? We needed lumber, we needed access to timber. So billions and billions of dollars of timber. This was an era where timber barons were the elite, were the rich people in the state. And so that wealth was stolen from Native Americans, and the Native Americans were then forced to move to Portland in basically another sort of version of forced relocation. Thousands came to Portland into a city that had been, it was barred to them. They couldn't live there up until the 1920s. It was against the law for Native Americans to live in city limits until the 1920s. So just within a generation, they were now forced to live in Portland. There were a few programs that came along with it. There were some educational programs. They were vocational education programs only, which vocational jobs were great jobs, But if you wanted to be a lawyer, if you wanted to be an engineer, if you wanted to be a doctor, if you wanted to be the educational programs gave you no opportunity to follow those types of dreams. And when the Native Americans came to Portland, they faced the same exclusionary practices that Robin described. Redlining, exclusionary practices around financing and neighborhood covenants. The last neighborhood covenant in Portland, does anyone know what a neighborhood covenant is? It's like you have a homeowners association basically, and you say, okay, neighbors, we're all going to agree that when we sell our house, we're not going to sell to a person of color. The last neighborhood covenant in Oregon didn't fall until 1987. Cedar Hills still had a neighborhood covenant saying you could not live here. So again, when the Native Americans were forced off of their very valuable land, they came to Portland and found that they had to face the same challenges as every other community of color to try to find a home. Okay, then another community of color, the Latino community. The Latino community had been actively welcomed, pursued, desired during World War II through the Bracero program. So the Bracero program basically said, you can come and live in Oregon and other agricultural communities all around the country, and we're not going to give you a path toward citizenship. No. We're not going to, make sure that you can live here permanently if you wanted to. But what you can do is you can live here for a period of time And then at the end of the war, at the end of the time that we're going to need you, you have to go home. And the farmers who had brought the laborers to the United States were supposed to pay for their workers' way back home. Many farmers didn't pay. The workers had been here then for like 5 years. They had, kids here, and their kids had started school, and they had formed connections, and many didn't want to leave. So in the 1950s, again, the 50s were just. The 1950s, there was an official, the first one was in the 1930s, following World War I. It was the same kind of thing, where there was a military operation to sweep through agricultural communities and without due process, grab folks and send them to the border. That was called the repatriation program. We did it again in the 1950s, and it was called, this was the official name of the military action. This was the government name on documents. It said, this is Operation Wetback. And it went into communities. There are still people in agricultural communities in like Woodburn and Cornelius who talk about the school buses coming in and sweeping people out, again, without due process. Around 1 million people were captured and deported. Half of them were U.S. citizens. So again, no due process. Brought to the border, dropped off, have a nice day, kind of thing. So now within the Latino community is the fastest growing community of color in the state of Oregon. It has grown 72, and Alice can tell me if I'm wrong, I probably am. It's grown 72% in the past 15 years. So that means that more and more Latino communities, or people of color, Latinos, are trying to find houses in Portland. And yet, the same factors that affect African Americans affect Latino communities in the sense that affordability has made it so that there are only, we just published an article about this, there are only 3 neighborhoods, Cully, one out in the Numbers, and then around Lentz, that are considered to be affordable to a Latino family. And also, African American families and Latino families face, there's a 2011 audit done of landlords, where people, like a white person, like I would go and try to apply for an apartment, and then an African American person with the same finances, the same qualifications would go, a Latino person with the same qualifications, the same finances would go, and in 64% of the cases, the white person would get the house. So there's a 64% more level of, higher level of discrimination against Latinx families and African American families in the state of Oregon, or in Portland. Again, I just want to, I'm going to pass it off to Alice, but I just wanted to really talk about the fact also that a lot of, again, the history makes the present. There are still families walking down the street today that were displaced by a Mayo hospital. There's actually, when you walk into a Mayo hospital, they've apologized, and there's like a plaque thing when you walk into the hospital. God forbid you ever actually have to go to the hospital, but if you do, it's right there. There are the names. Like, they know what, the hospital knows what it did, and yet no checks have been written. No, there hasn't been any sort of way in which there has been justice enacted. The people who were interned, the federal government twice apologized and wrote sort of these pittance of checks just make up for the fact that 4 years of their lives were lost in the camps and their businesses were taken. Where is the full justice in that respect? Where is the full justice for the communities that lost huge numbers of people through these government roundups? So not only do policies need to be put in place to enact a fuller sense of justice, there needs to be a recognition of how the past has created systems of oppression that we continue to live in every day in Portland.
Well, I think I want to go back to what Robin was, how Robin was framing it in terms of colonization and gentrification. And, really I think gentrification is the same forces as colonization, but within a country. And so I think, again, it is really that transfer of wealth from people who really have it, you know, Native Americans in their lands, Japanese Americans in Portland, and then moving that up and away from our communities to upper middle class communities. And I think we're seeing that as a whole in the nation overall for quite lower income people as well, that notion that wealth is moving more and more towards the top. And I also think it's important to think about how we justify it. You know, the justification within colonization, within gentrification, that it is all for progress. This notion of progress and who gets to decide what progress is, it really eliminates the voices of the community of what's important to them. And so one of the things that we were discussing as we were preparing for this panel is really thinking about the notion of housing as a human right. And what that means to individuals, how our communities define it, and then rethinking policies in that light, because I think it's until we tackle that notion of like our communities get to decide what progress is, as much as, you know, the broader general community gets to decide, we're going to end up with the same policy.